Okay, so yeah, like Andrew said, we're going to talk about Escoffier and umami, a term that although existed, although when he was alive, I'm sure he never had any contact with it. For me, it all starts back in about 1984 when I ran into a copy of this book, and why I bought it, I do not know. It was $25. It was remaindered. And in those days, all I bought was Chinese cookbooks. So for some reason, I bought this one. This book that comes out in 1907, A Guide to Modern Cookery, which is an English translation of the Guide Culinaire. The translator added a lot of stuff to it that Escoffier didn't have, including the concept of mother sauces, and that Escoffier had 5 mother sauces. That doesn't appear anywhere in the original. But that's not the important thing here. The important thing is there is this stuff called essences. And it all boils down to what he says in there is that essences, are stocks made in a reduced form so as to retain a very pronounced flavor. Nowadays, what some people would call a demi-glace, where they just take a stock and reduce it down to its gelatin. So I went a little bit farther back to the original, the 1903 original, and looked for I was interested in particularly in mushroom essences, and part of it is because of the fact that he mentions that the most in this book. He mentions it 27 times, but doesn't tell you how to make it. And to give you an idea of, the sort of, this is a recipe for creme anglaise, which, if you notice, is not a sweet one. This is a savory creme anglaise. And that the amount of essence used, all these ingredients in the beginning are all in either a deciliter or 100 gram measurements, a deciliter being 1/10 of a liter, which makes it 100 milliliters, which means it weighs 100 grams. So these are all equal volumes of butter, consomme, 2 times that of cream, and 1 of the essence of champignon. So you can see how this, whatever this essence is, it has a very important part of that. It's not just like, throwing in a pinch of salt. So I went looking elsewhere. My first place to always look for French stuff is the Roast Gastronomique, not the later versions, but the original. And besides being an absolutely beautiful book in a lot of ways and fun just to look through, it's very helpful for a lot of times. And so Montagnier has in here 12 essences running from garlic to truffles, or from A to T in French, and 4 what we nowadays call like extracts. So there's an almond extract and a cherry extract, and if you look at it, it's all chemicals. But if you go back to his mushroom essence, it's what he just translates out to is, this is merely the liquid greatly concentrated in which mushrooms have been cooked. It's used for flavoring sauces. So this could give us a clue. It's, maybe today what we would call an infusion. But I went back a little earlier. Montagnier, along with Prosper Salle, does this little book that is, it's 1,400 pages long. It's thousands of recipes. It's the largest cookbook, I think, that's ever been done in certainly this century. If you take, things like Modernist Cuisine, which is 7 or 5 volumes, this is a single volume. And there's a lot of recipes in here for essences. But looking at mushroom essences, we look at the second one first, we see that it really is just infusing. So we have a 1/2 liter of a light stock, and we have a 1/2 kilogram of tails, or what would be the stems and the peelings of mushrooms. These being, nowadays is considered equivalent to champignon de Paris or white mushrooms. This means commercial mushrooms. And you reduce this for a while, and then you pass it through a strainer to get rid of the solids, and you got it. But he also has this very interesting recipe here, which he says is from creme, and which it is. So we go and look at creme on this. let's see, it's almost word for word. Interesting, this comes out of a book that Crumb wrote 21 years after he died, which I always find interesting. It was obviously published by someone else. And I think there's a ghostwriter or a writer who got involved with it. But going back all the way to his first book in 1815, this is the first time he actually provides a recipe for mushroom essence. And it calls for you want to slice up 2 baskets of mushrooms, which immediately you may think, well, that's rather imprecise, how big's a basket? Well, it turns out that at Les Halles in Paris at the time, there was a standard. And one of these baskets held a 1/4 kilo of mushrooms, and their size had to be such there was 12 to 15 mushrooms per basket. So it gives us a lot of information here. And it's also what appears to be the earliest recipe I've been able to find for mushroom essence. Although, like I said, he's using it freely in all of his books earlier on. There's a curious ingredient in here, though, called a ham essence, which I immediately said, well, I guess we have to go now start looking for this. So I did. And there in Massiot in 1693, he has this, he talks about ham essence, and it's, the nearest I can tell, it's the earliest mention of this concept of essences. He mentions it 3 times and provides no recipes. And if you haven't figured this out already, this could be a trend where people talk about it, but they don't tell you how to make it. And since one assumes that you couldn't go down to the 7-Eleven and buy it, that seems to be a deficiency. But we have to remember also that all these books I've talked about so far, all written for professional chefs. So it may be part of the basic training that one gets in the restaurants or in the castle where they're learning how to do it. So then we have La Chapelle 40 years later, and he has more than 100 mentions of ham essence, which is, of course, the book is actually 3 volumes, so I guess there's space for it. Still no recipe. So the question is, where's the recipes? And looking through French sources in the 17th, 18th century, couldn't find one. I finally found one in Hannah Glass, British, 1747. She has 2, or has 1 recipe and 1 mention, I should say. So the first one is one using Westphalian ham. It's very complicated. There's 10 or 12 ingredients and, turn in circles and all sorts of other stuff. But in the introduction, she talks about it, and she says there's, using bacon instead of a leg of veal and ham works just as well. So I always thought that interesting. Viard in French not only has ham essence and, or excuse me, he doesn't have ham, but he has wild game, vegetables, chicken, and duck. He does provide 2 recipes, which are nothing more than concentrated broth. And then Ferret, who takes Viard and expands it, adds a few more in turkey and anchovies and lemon and citron essences, and still no mushroom essences. So we also have the reality that Crum's mushroom essence is in reality just a mushroom flavored broth. Later recipes by Dubois and Bernard, who wrote together, follow this pattern. Joe Fay, one of my favorite authors, also does the same thing. But in one of Dubois and Bernard's books, they write that the liquid exuded from just heating mushroom scraps is superior. And that gives us what I think is one of the best clues as to really how you can make it nowadays in the modern world and produce a really nice mushroom essence. Now, somebody who was writing for the middle class is Ado. This happens to be the 1884 cover because I couldn't find an earlier ones. The one I have is 1846, but it's too damaged to open up and photograph. And he basically says you take some mushrooms and you salt them to release their liquid, and then you flavor it and bottle it and use it, to flavor other sauces, which makes sense because there's a lot of vegetables, cabbage being a great one. Put some salt in it and you get a tremendous amount of liquid out of it. Also around the same time, we have Roques with this is not a cookbook, this history of edible and poisonous mushrooms. And he has this one line in there which caught me rather interesting, and which is to say basically mushroom essence in English is known as ketchup and fish sauce. So if you remember back that the English started importing fish sauce at the beginning of the 18th century, but it was rather expensive, so they tried to duplicate it in various ways. And they called it ketchup. And that's essentially what a dose preparation is just a mushroom catsup. So we have these mushrooms. Now the question is it essence or is it ketchup? And so let's look at ketchups a bit. Bradley, 1727, has the earliest ketchup recipes, including tomato ketchup and some other things. And his method is fairly simple. You take the gills from the mushrooms, heat them slowly. When they give up water, strain it and dilute it with some sack, which is like sherry, and you flavor with mace and cloves. Anybody who's sauteed some mushrooms, or first, if you do it over low enough heat, you produce a tremendous amount of liquid, and that's essentially what the essence is, and that's what we're going after. A few years later, an experienced English housekeeper, we have a similar thing: salt to draw out the moisture. In this case, she's putting it into a low oven to heat it, and then it's strained, flavored with ginger, cloves, black pepper, and allspice. Interesting combination, I think. Kitchener doesn't have any recipe, but he has this statement. You have the quintessence of mushrooms, and a tablespoon of it will impregnate half a pint of sauce with the full flavor of them in much greater perfection than can be obtained either from pickled or dried powder of mushrooms. So this is, I'd say a whole, hearted endorsement of mushroom essence. And so where are we? Is it, do we have essence or do we have ketchup? We have the extracted liquid from an ingredient, or is it an infusion? Both are said to add flavors to the dishes. And maybe the biggest question is, why are none of them used today? And the answer is, actually they are, but not as we think of it in the form of a liquid do we add. It's called MSG. Monosodium glutamate is the sodium salt of glutamic acid. Okay, there's also potassium salt, and there's 3 or 4 others that can be done. The sodium salt tends to work the best. It's 12% sodium and 88% glutamic acid. So when you put in liquid and it breaks down, only 12% of it is salt. I've heard people say, oh, you can't use MSG because I'm on a low salt diet. This is a minimum amount of salt. One of the theories, at least how it works, it's not a separate taste, because remember on the tongue we have tastes, not flavors. So a lot of people call it the 5th taste. It's not that. What it actually does, it bonds with this particular receptor that makes other tastes bond quicker or better with it. So it helps open up these other tastes. And, it's this receptor response, this we now call umami. Now, by way of comparison, if you look at common mushrooms, which is up here at the top of the second column, they have a bunch of free glutamate, and different protein glutamates are not considered free, and they don't affect the flavor. Free glutamates are required for the flavor, and we see up here on the left side, konbu is, what you make dashi out of, is the highest of the Western foods. Roquefort cheese is high. Parmesan cheese is high. Cured hams, getting down lower, there's a big jump. Tomatoes are another thing that's very high. So it's when tomato sauces are so pleasing. So the answer, I guess, is not mushroom essence, but just add some chicken powder. And the reason I say chicken powder is that I worked in a number of restaurants in France, most with Michelin stars. And up on a high cupboard somewhere near, or a high shelf somewhere near the stove, would be this cardboard carton of Maggi, which is another brand of instant chicken flour, or instant chicken powder, excuse me. And as you see, the fourth ingredient of this is MSG. The first is salt. And when, stocks or something like that were a little bit flat, they take a pinch or two of this, or sometimes a big handful, and throw it in order to help bring out the flavor of that item that was flat. So I guess you could say that, Escoffier's life would have been much simpler if you just added the pinch of, chicken powder instead of having to make essences and add those by the spoonful.